Gardening and fishing are two activities I avoid. My dad enjoyed gardening. He also enjoyed delegating garden tasks. As the oldest child, I was the first to be recruited to set out onion plants and pick green beans. It wasn't too long until I was old enough to cut the okra. We had a pair of old socks that we used to try to keep the okra from giving us the itch. Well, picking the okra wasn't bad enough. Yeah, I was given the task of pulling up the okra stalks. Those things developed some pretty good roots in one season. My dad thought I should garden, and I tried at a couple of places that we lived. I enjoy not gardening. As a youngster, I did a little fishing when Uncle Bernard came to visit. I found fishing to be a lot of standing around, waiting for a fish to bite. I didn't catch much of anything, so fishing didn't catch me. I find Meemaw's Kitchen a great place to catch fish. Our text this morning involves plants and fish. More specifically, Jesus tells two parables that deal with weeds and nets. Neil Lightfoot, in speaking of the two parables we'll study, had this to say: "Here again are two parables that should be studied together. Both of them deal with the coexistence of good and evil, and both teach that, although good and evil may stand side by side for a while, eventually a great and permanent separation will be made between them." Our text this morning is from Matthew chapter 13. We first look at the parable of the weeds as recorded in verses 24 through 30. We have the telling of the parable first. Jesus told them another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, 'Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?' 'An enemy did this,' he replied. The servants asked him, 'Do you want us to go and pull them up?' 'No,' he answered, 'because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn.'" Jesus tells a number of parables having to do with the kingdom of heaven. Jack Lewis said, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared is an expression characteristic of Matthew, occurring a total of 10 times. The phrase is in Mark and in Luke only twice each. But Jesus here says the kingdom of heaven is like, or may be compared. And it's not so much that he is comparing it to this particular landowner, but he's comparing it to the situation of the planting of the seed and the planting of the weeds by the enemy. A man sowed good seed in his field. He went to the effort to make sure his seed was the good seed. The enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. This occurred while the slaves were sleeping. This is not an indictment of the slaves, but their being asleep provided the opportunity to plant the weeds. The weeds were probably something known as bearded darnel. Bearded darnel was a poisonous ryegrass that was very common in the Middle East. Bearded darnel looked so much like wheat that it was called false wheat. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. At first, everything looked just to be like wheat growing. But you can tell a difference when the heads form because they do appear different to the trained eye. While the bearded darnel looked almost exactly like the wheat, those who knew the difference could tell it when the heads formed. Well, the slaves noticed this. They reported to the landowner, to their master. They questioned the source of the weeds. Now, One of the things I know from my limited experience of gardening is you really don't have to plant weeds. They always show up anyway. And so the presence of weeds would not have been unusual, but the large number surprised the slaves. Well, the owners replied that an enemy had planted the weeds. Sellers Crane Jr. said, sowing tares in an enemy's field was an act of revenge. It was an evil practice in Jesus' time, and it was prohibited by Roman law. There was even a law against doing it. Well, the servants proposed pulling up the weeds. The landowner answers no. The wheat and the weeds will grow together until harvest time. He no doubt knew that the roots of the darnel had crept underground and become intertwined with the roots of the wheat. If the darnel was pulled up, the wheat would be pulled up as well. Larry Chernard wrote, "The problem is not in distinguishing between the two plants, but because their root systems have become so intertwined, one cannot pull up the one without damaging the other." The landowner, the slaves knew there was a problem, but they did not need to deal with that problem just then. The harvesters, the landowner said, will be instructed to separate the weeds from the wheat. Now, bearded darnel is noxious, in other words, poisonous. Eating wheat mixed with the darnel would cause illness. R.T. France said the grains are poisonous, so that to have it mixed with wheat renders the crop commercially useless as well as potentially harmful. So after harvest, the wheat was fanned and then put through a sieve. The smaller darnel seeds were left after the fanning passed through the sieve, leaving the wheat behind. In some instances, women and children were given the tedious manual task of separating the wheat from the darnel, but at harvest time, the separation would occur. The weeds were to be bound into bundles and burned. Now, it could have simply been burned as rubbish. It's quite likely that the weeds were used as fuel, because fuel was, not a lot of trees around in those days to burn for fuel. The wheat will be gathered into the landowner's barn. Well, what does this parable mean? Jesus only gave explanation to 2 or 3 of the parables that he told. He did so with the parable of the sower that we studied last Sunday, and he does so with the parable of the weeds. We turn over a few verses to verse 36 and following. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." The disciples heard the parable, but they wanted further explanation. And so Jesus begins by allegorizing 7 critical elements found in the previous parable. The sower, he says, is the Son of Man. In other words, the sower is Jesus. Son of Man was Jesus' favorite designation for himself. He says the field is the world. Now notice, the field in this parable is not the church. It is not the kingdom of God. And so Jesus is here not addressing the subject of church discipline. That's a good biblical subject, but it's not being addressed here. In this parable, kingdom refers to the entire world. The good seed are the sons of the kingdom, those who are serving God. The weeds are the sons of the evil one. The evil one, the enemy, is identified as the devil, as Satan. The harvest is the end of the age, occurs at the end of the age. And harvest in the Old Testament was often used as a term of judgment. And so the day will come. Jesus says there will be a judgment. In the world, as it's going on now, we have evil, we have good. We coexist. But a judgment day is coming. We can be sure of that because Scripture says so. And at the judgment, all will be made right, because God, the perfect judge, will separate the wheat from the weeds. Those who are the wheat, are the weeds, will be punished. Weeping and gnashing of teeth. Not a very good picture, is it? On the other hand, the sons of the kingdom, the wheat, they will have a reward. They will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Jesus closes this parable as he does some others, that he who has ears, hear. We notice also that the harvesters are the angels. Angels are often selected to do the work of God. The point of the parable is, yes, you have good, you have evil, but there will come a time of separation, and the results will be final. Along with the parable of the weeds, we have the parable of the net. Beginning with verse 47. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? Jesus asked. Yes, they replied. He said to them, therefore, every teacher of the law who has been instructed about the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storerooms new treasures as well as old. Well, fishing was a very familiar idea in Jesus' day where he lived. This final parable in the series of 7 is a parable of judgment. One of the most lucrative industries in ancient Israel was fishing, which provided a favorite food for the Jews. Even today, fish from the Sea of Galilee is a delicacy on tables throughout the Middle East. So important was the fishing industry that one of the gates in Jerusalem was called the Fish Gate. In the New Testament, we read of several instances of fishermen washing, mending, or casting their nets. The sight of fishermen down around the Sea of Galilee was familiar to Jesus' hearers. The fishing was done with what was called a seine net, S-E-I-N-E. It was a special kind of drag net. It had floaters at the top, weights at the bottom. But several fishermen would cover a bed of fish with the net and drag it to shore. The same net was either dragged between two boats, or it could be laid out by a single boat and pulled to the land by long ropes. But when the same net was pulled to shore, the fishermen began to separate the clean fish from the unclean fish, the good fish from the bad. Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 define clean fish as those having scales and fins, while unclean fish were those without fins and scales, such as shellfish. Leviticus chapter 11 verses 9 through 12 reads, of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins or scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. And since you are to regard them as unclean, you must not eat their meat. You must regard their carcasses as unclean. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be regarded as unclean by you. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 9 and 10, of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales. But anything that does not have fins and scales, you may not eat, for you it is unclean. And so the command was very specific, very clear, and when the law was obeyed, there was some fish you could eat and there was some you could not. Well, Craig Keener, no known relation to me, wrote about this. Of at least 24 species of fish counted in the Lake of Galilee, many were unclean or inedible. And the net would not discriminate in its catch. If you're fishing with a net, it's just going to catch everything. Kind of like it. When we're pole fishing sometimes, in certain places, you may reel in an old boot or something that also you're not going to eat. You're going to throw away. But as the net swept through the water, all kinds of fish were caught. On the boat or on the shore, the fishermen sorted their catch. The good fish were put in containers and taken to the market to be sold. The rough and waste fish were thrown away. And this would certainly include the fish without fins or scales. Like the net, Jesus says the kingdom attracts people of varied motives and characters. But there will be a final separation at the time of the end. He says at the end of the age, the angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous. And he speaks of the punishment of the wicked. Neil Lightfoot observed about these two parables. Fish are either good or bad. What is not wheat is weeds. Jesus teaches in these two parables that men are either good or bad, and that there is no in between. We want to make sure that we are the good, that we're the wheat and not the weeds, that we are the good fish and not the bad. On an American troop ship, the soldiers crowded around their chaplain asking, "Do you believe in hell?" He said, "I do not." "Well then, will you please resign? For if there is no hell, we do not need you. And if there is a hell, we do not wish to be led astray." Here was one who was a chaplain. He was to be the spiritual leader for these soldiers. But he didn't believe there was going to be punishment for the wicked. The soldiers very quickly realized, we don't need you then. They knew about the wheat and the weeds, the good fish and the bad, and that judgment was coming. Let us remember that as well. Let us so live as to be prepared for that day.